I wonder, I mean, you are a natural optimist, but you paint a very difficult and gloomy picture, and indeed, right at the end there, this whole issue of maybe alienation from liberal democracy. I'd like to start by posing you one question in a way about yourself. I have a former colleague who I sent an invitation to this talk to, who responded that you were a lefty lawyer, and by implication that you would obviously distort things to fit in with your vision of the world. Can I ask you to describe not really your response to him, yes, it is a him, but your how you regard yourself, how you characterize yourself?
It's an interesting question. The only time I ever get called left wing is basically by right wing idiots who don't like what I have to say. it's a very funny pattern. I'm a centrist. I'm not a member of any political party. I can vote Labour, I could vote Lib Dem, I could vote Green. I don't have a particular party that I'm loyal to as a voter. In my constituency in Liverpool, frankly, this is a luxury situation for me to be in, because I think pretty much every constituency in Liverpool is about 85% Labour voting, including my own. So frankly, it doesn't really matter how I vote. So I don't regard myself as being politically aligned. There are probably some issues where I'd be characterized as a bit more left. There are probably some issues where I'd be characterized as a bit more right. But let's be frank, when somebody says, I don't want to listen to them because he's a lefty lawyer and he's only going to make the world fit his own view, I think that says a lot more about the person passing that comment than it does about the so-called lefty lawyer. And what's the point, frankly, of trying to justify myself? You may as well say that I'm an alcoholic pedophile, so don't listen to me. You know, it's easy just to rubbish somebody and say what they have to say is invalid because I don't want to hear it. But frankly, it doesn't reflect very well on your colleague.
Thank you. I tend to agree with you. Before I go into questions from the chat, I have one more, which is based on the alternatives that you put, which are either a close relationship with Europe or a distant one. And in the case of the close relationship, obviously we'd have to align ourselves with requirements from the European Union and so on. And in the case of a distant relationship, we would hope to strike out and do lots of things that we couldn't do as a member of the European Union. And it occurs to me that actually what we have is a lose-lose situation, because the second alternative is not going to happen. The law of gravity, the law of geography, the fact that we are part of Europe is going to mean that inevitably our principal trading partner is going to be the continent of Europe. We are not going to be able to strike out and do these amazing things. And therefore one wonders, you say the electorate may actually get alienated. I wonder if the electorate won't actually suss out what is going on and see the cost of Brexit, and therefore eventually come round to looking to do things in a different way. So it's lose-lose is what it seems to me at the moment, because we cannot do what it is said that we will be doing as global Britain, independent sovereign nation. Yeah, okay, you nod.
Oh no, I agree.
That's fine.
I agree with pretty much every word you said. So okay, rather than me repeat it in my own words and make it sound like I came up with the idea, yes, I agree.
Thanks. If it is like that, then I hope that one day a majority of the electorate we'll come round to seeing it that way. Right, now we have a question from chat, Vera Lustig, and she's talking about, would we not have avoided the problems if the whole of the UK had stayed in the single market and the customs union?
Yeah. We would have avoided lots and lots of problems, obviously, if the UK had stayed in the customs union, in the single market, the sort of softest of soft Brexits, as it were. And of course, remember, this was a position that was advocated by a certain group of Leave activists in the run-up to the referendum. Their argument was that the UK could leave the EU, but then become a member, to all intents and purposes, of the single market and the customs union outside the EU, but still play a leading role in the formulation of all of the rules and still exercise a significant degree of leadership from a position as a third country. They also argued that there would be much greater flexibility for the UK in how it, picking and choosing which rules it wanted to observe and which rules it didn't as a third country than as a member of the EU itself. Now, the problem is, of course, that was a complete fantasy. The reality of every country which is closely associated with the EU, whether it's in a general way like Norway under the European Economic Area Agreement, or whether it's in a much more sectoral way in fields like aviation or whatever, the reality is the EU makes the rules and you follow them as a third country. And the EU is constitutionally designed, this isn't just a political preference, the EU is constitutionally designed to exclude third countries from its internal decision-making procedures. Third countries do not get a say in the EU's rules. They just get to either accept them or not accept them on their own terms. So effectively, what we're saying is, and this is when I sort of said that it's a bizarre position to advocate, is that the UK, having been for decades one of the most influential voices in Europe, one of the main players around which many other member states gravitated and looked to the UK to represent and give voice to their interests, that the UK would give all of that up and simply become a rule-taking third country that effectively did what the EU said when the EU said it. Now, of course, that's a little bit simplistic. Of course, relations between the EU and Norway, for example, are a little bit more complicated than that, but they're not that much more complicated. There's nuance, but there's not a big difference between the reality and the summary I've just given. Remember, the Norwegians, while the language still meant something to anybody, often referred to themselves as a fax democracy, because a substantial part of Norwegian law was simply faxed through from Brussels. And the job of the Norwegian parliament was simply to rubber stamp it with a Norwegian stamp and enact it into Norwegian law. But that's pretty much the job that the Norwegian parliament did with a substantial part of its internal legislation. That's the cost which the Norwegians are very honest about. The Norwegians regularly carry out an evaluation of their relationship with the EU. And they're very open and frank about it, as you'd expect Norwegians to be. And they basically say, we need to be fully aligned with our European cousins, friends, brothers, sisters. We're not in a position where we can join yet because a significant part of the population isn't comfortable with that. In the meantime, we suffer as a democracy because substantial parts of our national life are determined at a table where we don't have a chair. But we'll live with that. We know it's not perfect, but we'll live with that. If the UK were to have an open and honest conversation with itself and to say, we don't want to rejoin the EU, we don't want to have a say, but we'll live with all of the consequences of what the EU does, that's fine, but we need to be honest about it. To me, that's a bit bonkers. Why don't you want to have a say? Why don't you want to be involved? Why don't you want to be at the decision-making table? So while I get the soft Brexit is a less bad Brexit than the one that we've ended up with, compared to membership, it's just weird. There's not even another word for it. It's just weird.
Okay, understood, and in fact, in my case, agreed. Now we have a question from John Gaskell on Northern Ireland and whether they're getting substantial economic benefits from being in the single market and the customs union. And I'll add to that whether there is in fact a level of sentiment in Northern Ireland which really rather favours the protocol, and whether there isn't a kind of difference of view between Westminster and the Stormont or the Northern Ireland people.
A very good question. In two parts. I'll deal with the first part first. Sort of what's happening with Northern Ireland. I have to say I'm a lawyer. I'm not a lefty lawyer apparently, but I'm a lawyer. I'm not an economist, and so I don't compile data. I don't analyze empirical data like that. All I can say is that what I said before. The protocol offers Northern Ireland certain advantages. There's no doubt about that. Northern Ireland retains full access to significant parts of the single market in the customs union, at least in the field of goods. And so far, there seems to be data which people have put together to show that Northern Ireland's trade with the Republic and the rest of the EU has soared. Just as, remember, the Republic's trade with the rest of the EU has soared, as its trade with the UK has, in some respects, collapsed. That shouldn't surprise us, huh? That was one of the intended consequences of the protocol. But we also have to recognize that one of the other inherent, inevitable consequences of the protocol was to disrupt trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And again, the statistics suggest that that has also happened. And I'm not surprised by that. That's what the protocol was meant to do. So I think we need to be honest. When it comes to Northern Ireland, the protocol has benefits, the protocol has costs. One of the inherent effects of the protocol is that Northern Ireland becomes more economically aligned and integrated with the Republic and the rest of the EU, and less economically aligned and less integrated with England, Scotland, and Wales. Now, how that works out for Northern Ireland economically in the longer term is anyone's guess. Certainly, I'm not in a position to evaluate it. But that's basically what the protocol was designed to do, and it appears to be what the protocol is actually doing in practice, even without the UK complying with half of the bloody thing to start with. So we'll see how those effects happen. Now, as for the second part of the question, what's the situation in Northern Ireland? Again, I'm a lawyer. I'm not a socio-legal sociologist who interviews people or conducts surveys. So I can only tell you what I know anecdotally from my own family and friends, or from what I read from the sociologists and the political scientists who actually do these things. Of course, the attitude in Northern Ireland is incredibly different from the attitude in England, or particularly in Westminster. But I think we have to recognize that Northern Ireland is not a normal society. And there is no point in saying, well, 60% of the population in Northern Ireland are happy with the protocol, if the 40% who aren't all come from one community and are increasingly alienated and aggravated by what's happening. And in a way, this is one of the things, again, that we have to be careful not to idealize or romanticize this protocol. The protocol was always going to cause consternation for unionists. It was always going to cause identity difficulties for unionists. Now, I come from Belfast. My family are nationalists. I would consider myself an Irish nationalist as well. Let's face it, the DUP are about as far removed from my sympathies as anybody could possibly imagine. But the simple fact is, the DUP and its voters exist, and you can't pretend they don't. And the only reason Northern Ireland has a positive future is if you manage to find a way to make the two communities work together and put their differences aside. One of the big betrayals of Johnson, of Northern Ireland, frankly, is the way that he has deliberately aggravated unionist concerns. And again, we shouldn't romanticize or idealize the protocol in this regard. That is an inevitable consequence of this protocol. Could it have been managed better? Yes. Could it have been communicated better? Yes. Do unionists need to accept that they aren't quite as loved by London as they love London in return? Yes, of course they do. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter in Northern Ireland whether you can say 52-48 are in favor of the protocol. The whole point is you need a broad cross-community consensus to prevent Northern Ireland from slipping into political destabilisation and potential social disorder. And in that regard, Johnson has failed Northern Ireland miserably, abysmally, and culpably.
Monica Dyer asks whether, given all that is going on, and I guess given developments in demographics and so on, you foresee that there will be reunification in the foreseeable future?
It's a very, very good question again. And again, I've got to sort of divide my own personal preferences. I'm an Irish nationalist, of course. I would like to see reunification with my hard-headed, pragmatist, sensible, rational person. The whole point of the Good Friday Agreement was that Northern Ireland would remain part of the UK for a considerable period of time, with the possibility of reunification at some stage in the future, but not for decades. Not for decades, and with plenty of time for the two main communities to learn to live together and work together and put their differences aside, to learn to live and work with people in the Republic and to build cross-border relationships and cross-border institutions, and basically to let identity sectarian politics dissolve over time so that people in Northern Ireland itself and in relations with the Republic would gradually adjust to the idea of what reunification might look like, how it might operate, and so on and so forth. One of the big tragedies of Brexit is that it has totally short-circuited that plan, because Brexit has basically done two big things. With the Unionists, it has terrified them into thinking that reunification might be right round the corner, and that their British identity is under threat, and that they're going to be forced into reunification with the Republic against their will, and so on and so forth. On the Republican side, it has fueled aspirations for reunification decades before anyone thought that it was even going to be a serious prospect. Now, when you put those two things together, what you end up with is a situation where the two main communities are no longer fully invested in the Good Friday Agreement, because Unionists are thinking that the whole thing is falling apart and they're going to be forced into unification against their will in the near future. And nationalists are thinking, well, there might well be a chance of reunification much sooner than we thought. So, well, why do we need to make these bloody devolved institutions work? We can go for unification and push for border polls. This is frankly the worst situation for Northern Ireland. Instead of the steady process of allowing the two communities to lose their identity sectarian politics, to learn to live and work together, to learn and to live and work with the Republic, we've ended up with a situation where unification is right back on the agenda, precisely in an identity sectarian way. There are two big challenges, I think, for that prospect of unification in the foreseeable future. The first is that Northern Ireland would simply descend into civil war. There's no point pretending otherwise. Northern Ireland would descend into civil war. When you have a situation where still a good 30% of the population are absolutely opposed to reunification, and even a small percentage of that number would either support or engage in violence to oppose it, we're talking civil war territory. But the second issue is the Republic. The Republic isn't ready for reunification. But why would the Republic want to have 2 million angry Northerners with their nascent civil war exploding into the Republic itself? The Republic is a happy, stable, wealthy, prosperous, civilized place. What it doesn't need is a civil war in the north that will then become a civil war in the south as well. So to be frank, am I in favor of Irish unification? Yes. Would I like to see it happen at some stage during my lifetime? Maybe on my deathbed. That was the timescale I was thinking. Do I think it's helpful or positive to be thinking about Irish reunification in the near future? Absolutely not. I think it's a potential disaster. And I say that as an Irish nationalist.
Yeah, very clear, Michael. Thank you very much. Absolutely clearly put. And I think that will disappoint a number of people but I think it's very difficult to find arguments against that. We're jumping around here. We have a question from Catherine Butler on the position of the Labour Party, if we may. She says, well, why, when the polls show that more of the population are disillusioned with Brexit, why does Labour still maintain it has to be a permanent status, a permanent situation? And I might add to that was, at some stage, will Labour have to get off the shelf and decide which side of the argument it's on? At the moment, it's playing both sides, taking no decisions, and it's a very unsatisfactory situation, you might say. Although, as you said on the Irish position, time is of the essence in so many of these factors for Brexit. Things have to congeal, heal over time. Maybe the Labour Party needs more time. What do you think about Labour's position? And you did mention earlier the issue of a progressive alliance. Where do you think Labour comes out on that, and indeed on electoral reform?
Okay, a very good question, and I sort of feel ill-equipped to answer it in the sense that I'm not a member of the Labour Party, and I don't think it's really my business to lecture the Labour Party on what its policy should be. But I'll do that anyway. So what do I think? Of course, it's not a very satisfactory situation that a party which should naturally be European, internationalist, liberal, and I don't mean liberal Democrat with a capital L, capital D, I just mean liberal Democrat in the sense of liberal democracy. Of course, it's very unsatisfactory that it looks like it's simply shut up and wants the whole Brexit issue to disappear and never have to think about it again, and almost looks a bit complicit in what's happened. But I think there are certain, there are certain benefits to Labour just shutting up about this issue for the time being. But purely political benefits. We're not talking matters of principle here. It's obvious that they don't want to come across as if they're immediately trying to undo Brexit. It's obvious they don't want to come across like they're trying to defy the will of the people. And of course, we know this is all rubbish, but it's the rhetoric that the Tories can easily use against them. I have to say, though, there is also something maybe a little bit sensible about Labour's position, in the sense that there maybe was a brief period of time when us lot could have said, well, we'll leave and we'll rejoin again in 5 years' time. Yeah, because we'll all say it's a big mistake, it's been such a mistake, it's such a catastrophe, we'll rejoin in 5 years' time, and the momentum will be there to do that. I hate to be the person who says this openly, but I suspect a lot of us are thinking of it. I think that moment passed, and I think we're now talking about a generation living outside the EU until the UK rejoins again. It might be in 15 years, it might be in 20 years, but I think we're talking about now a slow process of rebuilding the UK's entitlement to be a member state of the EU again. The Tories have done so much damage to the UK's relations with the rest of Europe, that quite frankly, I'm not sure there are more than half a dozen member states that would even let us back in for the foreseeable future, even if we wanted it. And in that respect, maybe Labour does have time to play with. Maybe Labour does have time to let Johnson, the damage of Johnson come through. Maybe it does have time to have a national conversation about what's best for the country without feeling like it's just immediately adopting a position that we all know it probably wants to adopt anyway. Maybe it does have time. And from that point of view, maybe we can all live with letting the Labour Party sort its act out a little bit without feeling too angry or frustrated about it. I'm being very generous here, because I'm trying not to be just irritated beyond belief. But I think although you asked me about Labour, though, I'm going to also add in a few comments about the Tories. There's always a risk in events like this that when I say the word Tory, it sounds like I quite happily watch them all sort of sink beneath the waves. And I think we need to be honest that the Tories of Boris Johnson are not the Tories of previous generations. They're not a conservative party. They're a Trumpist populist group of hard right ideological fanatics and cynical, ruthless gangsters. They are not a traditional right of center party in the way that we should recognize it in a liberal democracy. And I think this comes back to my point about the UK as a liberal democracy. We all need, whether we're Labour or Lib Dem or Green or whatever, the UK needs a sensible right of centre political force that offers a credible alternative to the electorate, because that's what democracies are about. We need a credible left-wing party, we need a credible right-wing party, we need a credible centrist party. We need all of those things to have a functioning, healthy liberal democracy. The problem is less with Labour, frankly, than it is with the Tories, because the Tories, or whoever replaces them, we need to get back to having a centre-right party that's capable of offering a credible liberal democratic alternative to a centre-left wing party for the future. I will never vote for them. I will never vote for that party, but it's for the good of the country and society that we have it. And in a way, I think that's more of a challenge than a challenge facing Labour. Labour's challenge is simply to decide the timing of when it unveils itself as a pro-European party that wants to rejoin the EU. The Tories' challenge is to actually salvage their sanity and their decency and reconstitute themselves as a proper liberal democratic centre-right political force.
Continuing on that theme of we need a centre-right liberal democratic party, we also need a centre-left. And at the moment, we have the Labour Party, who have no seats in Scotland. We have, I don't know what the result of the election is going to be tonight in North Shropshire. Does anybody know? It hasn't happened yet, I guess. So the question again is of progressive alliance and whether it's possible to have some kind of a progressive alliance to unseat this party that you have described, which is currently in government. And where that fits with the whole issue of electoral reform and first past the post, because first past the post seems to favour the Conservatives. So do you think that there will be some kind of a progressive alliance between the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the Greens, the Scot Nats? And do you think they would have a coherent message to put to win votes?
Another really good question that I don't particularly consider myself well qualified to answer, but I'll answer it anyway. The ideal is that whether it's a formal progressive alliance agreed between the political parties, or whether it's simply clever tactical voting on a massive scale by the electorate, that we manage to get in power a government, and the first act that it would do is scrap first past the post and replace it with a form of proportional representation. To be frank, first past the post is a cancer on the UK's political system. It was probably very well suited to an era when the empire needed a strong government in Westminster that would administer the far-flung corners of the globe without any dissent or opposition, because that's what the empire needed. It is not well suited to a modern, diverse country such as ours that simply has to find a way of working and living and being together without undue division and living life with compromise and consensus rather than actively seeking to demonize and divide the population between itself, which frankly is what first past the post tends to do, besides not being particularly democratic, because you end up with governments that get 30% of the vote having gigantic parliamentary power, which is virtually unchecked by any other institution. So that would be my dream. The very first act of the new government would scrap first past the post, introduce PR, and then set about the process of drawing up a written constitution that would actually protect us as individual citizens from the abuse of state power in the future. But I'm allowed to dream. vote for very different political parties at different points in your lives and at different points here and there. But you're bound together by a certain set of values and ideals about how society should function and how the world should work. And so in some respects, if the European movement can do it, I don't see why the rest of them can't either. And I would hold myself up, if I were you, I would be holding myself up as a model progressive alliance that the rest of them should learn something from, because in a way it's the best model you could possibly have. But on that particular note, I'm going to wish you all a very lovely Christmas. Stay safe and take care of yourselves.
Take care.